In the last podcast, I explored the relationship between affect and meaning, as Freud saw it at the turn of the last century, and then how Daniel Stern related to it from a more recent developmental standpoint. In this podcast, I want to hold on to that theme of affect as a central concept to music psychotherapy, and to link that observable phenomena to the post-Freudian, Kleinian and post-Kleinian world of projective identification, introjective identification and containment, and their relationship to what Esther Bick called a psychic skin. Esther Bick described how a baby in its first 6 weeks of life is in a symbiotic state with the mother and unintegrated in itself, unable to differentiate their emotional life from bodily experience, and needs an outside object into which they can project, which when re-introjected performs the function of containment. This, Bick believes, leads to a sense of integration, cohesion and a sense of self. The external object is undifferentiated. It's composed of experiences of continuous interaction between a physically and emotionally holding and mentally containing mother and the surface of the infant's body as a sensory organ. But let's start with Stern and his sequel to the interpersonal world of the infant, The Diary of a Baby, in which he imagines the mind of a 6-week-old infant based on both close scientific and psychoanalytic observation. As Joey's hunger grows, it begins to superimpose its own order on the disorganization. He breathes faster, sharper, more jaggedly. Soon his voice, the vocalizations that made the cry sound, come into play. Joey's breathing, like the wind, and his cry, the sound, are not yet integrated. Sometimes he breathes without voicing. Sometimes short cries punctuate the end of an expiration but do not yet overlap its full length. Sometimes the crying expirations last too long, as if the wind and its sound have separated. His arm and leg movements are not synchronized, and for Joey, the world is disintegrating. Daniel Stern had in his previous work, The Interpersonal World of the Infant, collated the empirical evidence for symbiosis. This had, since the birth of the Kleinian school, been understood by psychoanalysts as a shared psychic state, in which, to quote the post-Kleinian Joyce McDougall, the mother becomes the child's apparatus for thinking thoughts. Stern criticised this based on careful scientific experimentation and showed, I think, convincingly that although this is an attractive assumption, that instead, as the human organism develops, even in its most primitive state, in utero and then as a neonate, specificity and autonomy are hardwired into the baby's sensate experience. That being said, the need for attachment and shared experience are also by Stern valued. Psychoanalysis, for its part, has always valued theory based on observation, and their empirical evidence is gathered in each session with the patient, often looking back into the more primitive states as they appear within the transference, fused with the commerce of daily experience. Music psychotherapists value the affective communication that Stern describes in that same work because it is musical and because it seems to provide containment, both for unspeakable or pre-verbal distress, but that also within that containment there is a means for decoding the roots of that distress. The idiosyncrasies of the patient's defensive musical expression we decode as having a relationship to the patient's inner world through our countertransference. how it affects us. Freud, as I described in the first podcast, talked of a telephone receiver through which the unconscious of the patient is reconstructed as a function of the reverie, the free-floating attention that the therapist adopts as his stance. Bion, half a century later, described how a psychic container manages to transform primitive distress, hatred and envy, for example, through the empathic understanding of these qualities, and that this transformation is finalized through a process of re-internalization or introjection that occurs in the contained, i.e. in the mind and body of the baby, child, person or patient, as the other half of this dyad, the container contained. Freud had initially described projection as a deflection of the death instinct, and here Klein now describes an ego suffering annihilatory anxiety, a fear of death, and that in order to manage this, not only does the ego split into good, which can become idealized, and bad, which becomes toxic with hate and neglect and fear, but pushes this out as a projection, evacuates the unmanageable feelings into an object. The mother or therapist then comes to contain the bad parts of the self, and this identification of the badness in the object by the subject is not felt as separate because the object becomes the bad self. In psychotic disorders, this identification of an object with hated parts of the self contributes to the intensity of the hatred directed against other people. Projection of a predominantly hostile inner world, which is ruled by persecutory fears, leads to the introjection, the taking back of a hostile external world. And finally, this introjection of a distorted and hostile external world reinforces the projection. In this way, Melanie Klein was able to offer us for the first time a psychodynamic formulation for the paranoia, hallucination and delusion that psychotic patients present with as they project into the environment elements of their internal world they have evacuated out. Klein was clear that the projection of good feelings and good parts of the self into the mother is essential for the infant's ability to develop good object relations and to integrate his ego. However, if this projective process is carried out excessively, good parts of the personality are felt to be lost, and in this way the mother can become idealized. The therapist also can become idealized. This process, either in early functioning or minute by minute in a session, can result in a weakening and impoverishment of the ego. But in the case of introjective identification, Klein talks about good aspects of the breast, the earliest of part objects, is exaggerated as a safeguard against fear of persecution. And a denial of psychic reality becomes possible then through strong feelings of omnipotence. She describes as an essential characteristic of early mentality, but also in the grandiosity in bipolar conditions and some other psychotic-related illnesses. Bion later built on these ideas with his abstraction, the container contained. He envisioned beta elements, or unthought thoughts, as yet unsymbolized raw sense experience that is in need of the alpha function of the mother or the therapist to transform these beta elements into thoughts. He famously described that what cannot be thought about gets acted out. For the music psychotherapist, we can see how the patient's musical expression can come to convey just this quality. And if the therapist is open to the patient, and by sensitive affect attunement, the therapist can begin the process of accepting and acknowledging this projective material, allowing themselves to be affected by it. If they are a skilled clinician, they can provide the means then to stimulate curiosity about this material, either through careful linking of musical aspects of the patient's expression and then returning them, or after playing through verbal interpretation of the material, making links with other transferential elements. A decade later, Thomas Ogden described projective identification in interpersonal terms. He showed that the unconscious communication from the patient doesn't always receive its alpha function in the therapist's mind, and that the therapist can come to identify with the patient's projection. This creates an acting out by the therapist, a countertransference enactment, in accordance with the patient's expectations. In this instance, we can say that the unthought thoughts have not been contained and transformed. In music psychotherapy, our acting out, I believe, is much more common. In fact, I think it is the act of playing itself. If this is true, then our greatest asset is also potentially our greatest limitation. However, if we learn from what we come to play intuitively, we can decode the affect with which we are responding as the expression of a split-off and projected part of the patient's disturbance. It is interesting, for instance, to note that the patient may play very little while we find ourselves playing far too much, or vice versa, that the affect that the patient displays may cause a reactive opposition or an unexpected disjunct in the therapist's music through just this process of countertransference enactment. If the music psychotherapist can become aware, as he is playing, of these unconscious themes, his music will change and the patient is likely to respond differently. The immediacy, for example, with which the patient affects us as soon as we meet them, lasts through the session, both in the music and during periods of silence and verbal discourse. In the next podcast, I would like to look in much more detail at the music psychotherapist's stance to best make use of the subtle tools that we have begun to describe here.